Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another CS 591 SEC. We're pleased to have you join us, and our speaker today is somebody that I've known and worked with, about 2 decades, Stu?
Something like that.
Yeah. Stu is a principal engineer at MITRE. So Stu has been at the forefront of many of these areas in security and privacy for decades. He's also been very active in the area of how technology impacts society and the public. And in particular, one of the areas of interest is in privacy, where he has led a number of efforts working in areas of privacy risk management, privacy engineering, privacy enhancing technologies. Some of you may know MITRE as a place that originated organizational concepts such as CVEs and the attack framework to help understand about cybersecurity problems. Stu is approaching this from the standpoint of privacy, which is increasingly gaining in public awareness and is a major driver of cybersecurity concerns about AI and other areas. So this is extremely timely. And rather than take any more time, let me tell you, there's not a better person who could be talking about this than Dr. Stu Shapiro. And please, take it away.
Thank you, Spaff, and thank you for the opportunity to present. So this talk is a funnel talk. I'm going to start general and get progressively narrower. So first, some stage setting. Anytime you're doing risk assessment, and this can be pretty much any kind of risk assessment, security risk assessment, safety risk assessment, privacy risk assessment, there are basically two things involved. There's a risk assessment methodology, and that methodology is leveraging a risk model. The risk model is what tells you what is and isn't a risk and how worried you should be about those things that are risks. Whenever you're doing risk assessment, there's a risk model somewhere in there. There has to be, because if there isn't, you're basically doing an arbitrary assessment. You may as well be throwing darts at a dartboard. And when you're doing risk modeling, basically what you're trying to do is construct this cuboid. It's a cuboid because it isn't necessarily strictly a cube. As the general saying goes, threats exploit vulnerabilities that result in adverse consequences. And so there's an axis or a dimension for each of those. And so every one of the cells in that cube represents an alignment between a particular threat, a particular vulnerability, and a particular consequence. The risk assessment is going to tell you which of those alignments you actually need to worry about. And typically there are going to be a lot of them that you don't need to worry about because for one reason or another, they don't align in the context of your specific system or in the context of your environment and so on. Now, interestingly enough, although I've just referred to risk modeling, the fact of the matter is each of these dimensions can be its own modeling activity. So you can, and we do develop consequence models. We can develop vulnerability models, and indeed, we can develop threat models. We can do threat modeling. And in privacy, at this point, we've actually got a fair number of kind of, if you will, canned consequence models. And I'm going to actually bring up one in particular in a few minutes. We've got a few things for privacy vulnerability modeling. Historically, we have had very little in the way of privacy threat modeling capability. We're starting to see a few more things lately, but they tend to focus modeling adversaries, on modeling threat actors, and less so on modeling attacks. But before I get to that, I want to draw some important distinctions between privacy and cybersecurity, which clearly are related, but they are distinct things. And let me speak to that in terms of risk. So, here you see definitions of cybersecurity risk and privacy risk according to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The cybersecurity definition, probably most of us are well aware of, basically boils down to the loss of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability. Privacy risks, those are, according to NIST, associated with privacy events arising from data processing. That is admittedly not a particularly informative definition, but we'll run with it for our purposes here today. The important thing I want to call attention to is that intersection between the two. Those are confidentiality failures that involve personal information. And when we were developing Panoptic, we made a conscious decision to exclude those kinds of things from the scope of our model. Confidentiality events concerning personal information, think data breaches, right? And as we all know, there are lots and lots of data breaches. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of data breaches are the result of security failures, compromised security controls. And as a result, cybersecurity threat modeling actually can address those fairly well. And so for that reason, we decided to rule those kinds of events out of scope. So what we're focusing on, what I'm going to be focusing on here, is basically that Pac-Man shape at the right when you remove all of the cybersecurity risk bubble. Now, if you're talking about threats, well, there's some important distinctions there between cybersecurity and privacy. So when we think about cybersecurity threats, we're typically thinking about a malicious adversary, some other who is doing stuff to compromise security controls, doing stuff to effect adverse consequences. And all of that can be true of privacy as well. You can have malicious others who are trying to do something to compromise privacy. But privacy is different in that it's broader than that. Because in privacy, threats can arise from inactions as well as actions. Think about a failure to obtain consent for the collection or use of personal information, for example. Privacy threats can certainly be malicious, but they can also be benign. The privacy threat might be a side effect of a system or an actor trying to do something else. The objective isn't to compromise privacy per se, but nevertheless, privacy is being compromised as sort of collateral damage. And then finally, while certain threat actors can certainly be these others with respect to privacy, it's also the case that a threat actor in privacy can be the system itself, right? A system which is doing something which compromises privacy, and again, not necessarily because that's the purpose of the system, but one way or another, privacy is being compromised, and therefore the system itself is actually the threat actor. So in all those ways, when we think about privacy threats, we have to broaden our thinking beyond what's typically the case for cybersecurity. All right, so let me get into privacy threat modeling per se. And let me start with a general definition of threat modeling. This is one which I think is generally accepted. And I've underlined attack taxonomies here because that is what Panoptic is. Panoptic is a privacy threat taxonomy, much in the same way that MITRE ATT&CK, yes, I need to get a plugin for MITRE ATT&CK, in much the same way that MITRE ATT&CK is a cybersecurity attack taxonomy. As it turns out, threat modeling is actually good in and of itself for any number of things. Earlier, I was talking about, the threat modeling dimension of a larger risk model, but doing threat modeling can get you a number of other benefits as well. It can help you do gap analysis, allow you to make prioritization decisions, do red teaming or facilitate red teaming, track a specific adversary's set of techniques, and it can even help you better evaluate new technologies. So there's a lot to be said for threat modeling. Well, as I said, Panoptic is an attack taxonomy, and so let me talk more specifically about privacy attacks. And this is our definition of a privacy attack. Actions or inactions, right? Remember, I was actions that cause a perceived privacy harm. And I'll emphasize the perceived there because from our perspective, if an attack or if the quintessential reasonable person would perceive themselves to have been subjected to a privacy harm as the result of an attack, then that is in fact a privacy attack. Now, what constitutes a privacy harm? Well, those are things which are defined by something called Solovs Taxonomy, and I'll get to that in just a second. But there are also things that do not solely involve cybersecurity violations. Now, we say solely there because it's certainly possible that you could have a cybersecurity violation that is a precursor to something that is a privacy attack. There's a data breach involving personal information, and then the personal information gets used, to commit identity theft or what have you. So, the cybersecurity attack morphs, if you will, into a privacy attack. But a privacy attack is something which does not solely involve cybersecurity violations. All right. So let me talk for a moment about Solovs Taxonomy. The full name here is Solovs Taxonomy of Privacy Harms or Privacy Problems. So this was developed quite a few years ago at this point by Dan Solov, who is a very well-known privacy researcher, a law professor at GWU. And what he did was he developed this from the bottom up, rather than start with some overarching definition of privacy and privacy harms. He surveyed the privacy case law and basically just tried to zero in on the things that people seem to consider privacy problems or privacy harms. And then he set about developing a categorization for the things that he observed. And what you see here in front of you is that categorization. There are 16 of these things, which fall into 4 larger buckets. And this is our basis or has been our basis in developing MITRE Panoptic for what does or doesn't constitute a privacy harm. There are other, and so it's a consequence model. It's a privacy consequence model. There are others, but this is well known. It's well regarded. People will frequently reference it. And so we decided to go with this as the basis for establishing whether or not there actually had been a privacy harm. All right, so let me give a few concrete examples of privacy attacks. Washington State, like a lot of states, it may be all the states, I'm not sure, will often provide de-identified data sets of hospital records. These are not, I don't think, kind of full-blown health records, but there'll be kind of basic records regarding hospital admissions and discharges and diagnoses and all that kind of stuff. And they de-identify them and make them available to, well, pretty much anybody who wants to pay $50 or whatever it was that this thing costs. So a researcher paid for a copy of one of these data sets and set about trying to re-identify it, and discovered that they could plausibly re-identify nearly half the records in this data set. Lenovo Superfish is a really interesting one. Lenovo basically man in the middle their own laptops. And so they had this mechanism in there, this software, which basically intercepted the web traffic from the browsers on the laptop. And it, based on this traffic, it developed profiles, and it used those profiles as the basis for serving pop-up ads, which the users did not, consent to. All right, finally, probably the mother of all privacy attacks, at least in recent memory, Cambridge Analytica. A personality survey was used to develop psychographic profiles of people, and those profiles were used as the basis for creating models, which could then be used for purposes of political manipulation. All right. Now, the thing that all of these have in common, aside from the fact that they're privacy attacks, is the fact that nowhere in any of these was there actually a security failure. Right? Arguably, security failures played no role in any of these. These were all purely privacy attacks, not security attacks. All right. So that brings me to Panoptic. And you've probably been wondering, what the heck does Panoptic stand for? Does it stand for anything? Well, here you can see what it stands for, the Pattern and Action Nomenclature of Privacy Threats and Context. And it's at this point that I will note that developing Panoptic has been very much a team effort. I'm the one here today speaking to you, but Panoptic is the product of a lot of hard work by a lot of people other than myself. However, I will claim exclusive credit for this. The Panoptic acronym is my baby. I came up with this, and I am not sharing the credit with anybody. As a matter of fact, some of my colleagues would probably maintain that development of this acronym has been my singular contribution to the project. All right, so how did we develop Panoptic? Well, we actually took our inspiration, not terribly surprisingly, from MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK was developed from the bottom up, from the ground up, based on a data set of actual empirical security attacks. And so we took the same tack with Panoptic. Panoptic, or at least version 1, has been developed on the basis of 154 empirical privacy attacks, non-breach privacy events, following the, at least at a high level, the methodology that Garfinkel and Theophanos used in their 2018 paper. That data set consists, for the most part, of FTC and FCC cases, so actual cases that have been documented by the Federal Trade Commission, by the Federal Communications Commission. And this is the overall structure of Panoptic. Panoptic is actually two taxonomies in one. So there's the actual threat taxonomy, which is over on the right here, and those are the privacy activities. But there's also the privacy contextual domains over here on the left. It's kind of a nostrum at this point that privacy is highly contextual, and we certainly agree. And we felt that that context for any given attack really needed to be captured, because it can be the case that the context plays a fundamental role in making something a privacy attack. That if the context was different in some respects, there are some privacy attacks that might not be considered privacy attacks. And so we basically have these two taxonomies that actually work together. So here you see the privacy contextual domains, and underneath each domain is a set of privacy contextual elements. In some cases, there are also privacy contextual sub-elements. As far as the domains themselves, I'll just run through those quickly since there aren't very many of them. So for environment, is the environment of the attack digital? Well, it typically is, but it can also be physical, and that is also an option. And those aren't mutually exclusive. You can actually have attacks in which the environment is both digital and physical. Distribution. Does the attacker distribute personal information to anybody, or do they distribute it to one entity, many entities, basically all entities? Interaction has to do with how frequently the victim, the subject of the attack, interacts with the attacker or their proxy, and it can also be the victim's proxy as well. And I'll say more about that when I go through an example in a moment. Engagement has to do with whether the attack specifically goes after particularly sensitive populations like children, for example. And then finally, of course, we've got data types, because you've got to know what kinds of data you're dealing with in a privacy attack. All right, here you see the privacy activity. So this is actually the threat taxonomy proper. And underneath each privacy activity, you have a set of privacy threat actions. And in this case as well, sometimes the threat actions have sub-actions associated with them, which are more particular, more specific. You may be relieved to know that I'm not going to go through each and every one of these privacy activities. Rather, I'll note that it's kind of a mix of things which would be recognizable as fair information practice principles. So these are kind of the foundation of informational privacy pretty much around the world. They were first developed, the first instance of them was actually developed in the US, but since then they've been taken up by various entities and refined, expanded. Those entities include, by the way, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and also the fair information practice principles are at the core of GDPR in the EU. GDPR is broader than just FIPS, but they're kind of at the core. Also making up the privacy activities are various stages of the information life cycle. So you can see collection there and processing and so on and so forth. And with respect to FIPS, you can see there's notice, consent, and so on and so forth again. And then finally, there's some odds and ends here that we felt that we needed to have. So, for example, there's identification, because a key aspect of a privacy attack can be the act of assigning an identifier or specifically identifying someone. Likewise, deviations at the very end there, the far right. Deviations is kind of our one nod to compliance issues. So, for example, if a threat actor has violated their own privacy policy, that would be a deviation threat action. And just in case you were wondering, yes, there is stuff in those boxes. And I'm certainly not going to attempt to go through all of these here. Here you see the various privacy contextual elements, and you can see there's an indexing scheme, an enumeration scheme that goes along with those. What you're seeing are just the elements. We have not included the sub-elements here because you would just get too busy. Yeah, this can give you a sense of the contextual elements that are included under all the different contextual domains. And here are the contents of the privacy activities. Here are the contents, I should say, of the privacy threat action boxes. And even more so, we have not included sub-actions here, or it would be even less readable than it already is. So, there's a fair bit of threat actions here to support the mapping of a specific attack. When we were initially developing Panoptic, we were actually kind of deconstructing the various attack stories and trying to look for common elements. And that was kind of how we evolved the initial set of categories. Once we had our initial categories, our initial contextual domains, our initial privacy activities, we further developed Panoptic by simply mapping attacks to the taxonomy. And basically, anytime we ran into an issue, anytime we ran into a problem, we would examine what exactly was causing the problem, and if need be, we altered the taxonomy in response to that question or problem. And so that's how Panoptic has evolved. It's become a matter of just repeatedly mapping attack after attack after attack, and where we see a need to make adjustments, then the taxonomy gets adjusted. In some cases, that can involve inserting a new element or sub-element or threat action or sub-action. In some cases, it can be relabeling a particular element or action. And in other cases, it can be a matter of redefining a contextual element or a privacy threat action. All right, so let me go through an actual example so you can get a better sense of how this works. So this attack is based on a company called Nomi. And Nomi aimed to enable brick and mortar retailers to understand the foot traffic within their stores, to track and analyze the movements of their customers. And they did this by installing Bluetooth sensors and the sensors picked up the Bluetooth signals of their customers' phones and hashed the MAC addresses, used those as pseudo identifiers. They developed, and then they tracked each individual customer, developed a profile for each of those customers. All of that data went to NOMI. They then developed, they then aggregated that information, ran some analytics on it, and sent the reports back to their customers. Now there was a website. They had a website where they explained all of this and kind of who their customers were, and or at least I assume, and provided an opt-out mechanism. They claimed that there were also notices and a way to opt out in the stores. In fact, there wasn't. There was no notice, and there was no opt-out mechanism in the store. And so that's kind of the attack in a nutshell. So how would we go about mapping this in Panoptic? Well, first of all, the environment. Well, it's certainly digital because they're collecting all this data and they're analyzing it and it's moving around. But of course, it's also physical as well because the attack is taking place in specific physical locations within these brick and mortar retailers. They were also capturing the Bluetooth signals from people who were just passing by outside the stores. For distribution, well, the analytical results went back to the specific establishments from which the data was collected, which kind of makes sense because, why would a given retailer be interested in how customers were moving around somebody else's store where they had no idea, what they were selling or what the configuration was, and so on. But it was also one to many because NOMI also provided or also informed retailers of when any of their customers were frequenting other locations in the same chain of stores. So we have both one-to-one and one-to-many in terms of distribution. In terms of individual and in terms of interaction, there was no individual interaction, right? Individuals were unaware that any of this was taking place. They were not interacting with the threat agent at all. Their phones were. And so what we have is discrete proxy interaction. The phones are acting as proxies for the individuals, and the interactions were discrete because they were only happening when people were frequenting these physical establishments. There was no engagement with sensitive populations. They, grabbed everybody's data, without discriminating. And in terms of the data types, well, obviously location, behavior, because they're looking at the way people are moving around the stores. And of course, they have this persistent pseudo identifier to enable them to track people around the stores. All right, so that's the mapping, that's the contextual mapping. Now, how about the actual attack, the privacy activities? All right, well, as I said, they had a notice on their website. They did not have a notice in the stores. And so we have one type of attack actually has things out of sequence. So because there was a notice, but people were unlikely to have gone to the website first to check out the notice before actually going into the stores, the attack is actually an out of sequence notice. Or I should say the threat action is actually an out of sequence notice. They claimed that there were going to be notices in the stores, and they also claimed that there were going to be opt-out, there was going to be an opt-out mechanism in the stores, neither of which was true, and therefore you had a misleading or false notice. And by the same token, the consent was also out of sequence. And the consent also, and there was also no opt-out, in the stores, as was promised. And so we have those threat actions for notice and consent. In terms of data collection, well, there's what we call tracking and affording tracking. So when we say affording, that's when somebody facilitates tracking. Somebody makes functionality available, a tracking mechanism, something. They're not actually doing the tracking themselves, but they are facilitating the tracking. But in this case, they were actually doing the tracking. NOMI was through their Bluetooth sensors that were installed in these establishments. And they were doing this by sniffing, which is to say they were capturing the emanations of these phones, these proxies for individuals, capturing the MAC addresses and hashing those to use as pseudo-identifiers. And that involved assigning an identifier. And in our lexicon, we consider this to be fingerprinting, taking this this piece of data that's emanating from the device and converting it into a pseudo-identifier. They were doing single source profiling, which is to say there was a single source of data, namely the Bluetooth emanations from the smartphones, and they were creating profiles of individuals because they were, they were looking to see how individuals moved around the stores. But they were also doing what we call clustering, because they were aggregating all of this data, taking the individual profiles and aggregating everything together and creating a profile, in a sense, a profile at an aggregate level for how customers were moving around the stores. And they were also deriving new information, new aggregate information. This is the stuff that they were sending back to the retailers about how their customers moved about their stores. And of course, at the end of the day, this was all about behavioral analysis, another aspect of processing. There was no specific threat action involved here under sharing, but nevertheless, data was getting shared. And so because that was the case here, we highlight the privacy activity itself as opposed to a threat action under it. And then finally, we have deviations. They were deviating from their own stated policy regarding notice and consent. So this is what the mapping looks in a much prettier form. This is the contextual mapping, and this is the activity or threat mapping. And so, that's what a mapped attack looks like in Panoptic. Which leads me to wind up with, so what? Well, what we're trying to do with Panoptic is use it in particular for three main purposes. We're trying to use it to facilitate comprehensive privacy risk modeling. Remember I said, well, we've got consequence models, we've got a few vulnerability models. We don't have a lot in terms of threat models, and in particular in terms of threat models that focus on attacks. And so we're trying to facilitate development of holistic privacy risk models. But the fact of the matter is you can use Panoptic as a standalone threat model in order to do both system-specific and environmental threat assessments. And you can also use it for red teaming purposes. You can identify particular attacks or attack patterns and associate those attacks with particular adversaries, and use those as the basis for developing red teaming campaigns. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do really is move the needle from compliance to risk management to threat-informed privacy defense. In privacy, people very much tend to be compliance-oriented. They just want to make sure that they're ticking off the check boxes, following the rules. A minority will be trying to do something which is closer to risk management, and an even smaller minority is going to be trying to do threat-informed privacy defense. And with Panoptic, we're just trying to move that needle. We're not, deluding ourselves that we're going to change this all overnight or result in wholesale changes. We're just trying to move things along toward a better state of practice. In terms of coming attractions, right now we have Panoptic 1.0 finished. We are in the middle of mapping a second data set. Our first data set, as I said, was FTC and FCC cases. Our second data set is drawn from New York Times stories and Reddit postings. In a few more weeks, we will have completed the data set 2 mapping, and that's going to produce Panoptic V2. Once we have that, we're going to do some clustering analysis to try to identify generic attack patterns. You may recall that the P in Panoptic stands for patterns, and so we're planning to get to that shortly. We're also starting to develop a navigator tool to help people work with and use Panoptic. And we're trying to stand up a public web page on MITRE's site where we can stick these various resources and make them freely available to people. Trying to get this web page approved is proving more difficult than any of us ever imagined in our wildest dreams, but we are getting there, and that will hopefully be up in the not too distant future, along with either Panoptic V1 or V2, depending on the time frame. Finally, I do want to explicitly acknowledge the rest of the Panoptic team, and in particular, Kara Bloom, who was the original PI on this project. A few months ago, she left MITRE and went over to Netflix, but certainly we would not be where we are with Panoptic if it had not been for her. And with that, I will conclude, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stu. So what we'll do with questions is if they show up in the Q&A, you can answer them there. So I'll ask one. If people from outside are interested in contributing to this work or giving feedback, what's the best way to do that?
Well, as you see, we do have an email address where people can contact us regarding Panoptic. We just last month held the second workshop on privacy threat modeling as part of SUPS, the Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security. And as the name suggests, we're hoping to make this an annual event. So if people want to contact us, we do have a listserv as well, a privacy threat modeling listserv. And among other things, if people drop us a line to the Panoptic email address, or you can email me personally, we can stick you on that list, and you'll get a heads up when we're planning the next workshop and soliciting contributions. We're also actually looking for beta testers for Panoptic. And so if there's anybody who might be in a position by virtue of somebody they're working for or a project they're part of, and interested in serving as a beta tester, we'd love to talk further about that. Once we've got our public webpage up, then we expect that there will be further opportunities for people to contribute. Oh, and I should also say, as strange as it may sound, kind of at the same time as we're doing beta testing, we're actually doing alpha testing too, which sounds kind of weird because, beta is supposed to come out after alpha. But we are trying to do some alpha testing and just get more general feedback on Panoptic and people's reactions to it, and how likely it is that people might take it up and use it. And so if you're interested in being an alpha tester, which really just amounts to being willing to submit to a semi-structured interview, then please drop us a line as well.
Great. I don't see any Q&A popping up yet. Let me ask another question. Do you have any provision possibly for interns next summer who would be interested in this topic?
I possibly. I say possible. I would love to say absolutely. I have to temper that because unfortunately, funding to continue this work into next year is not assured. I honestly don't know, in fact, what the probabilities are really that we're going to get continued funding. Getting funding for the IR&D projects within MITRE is extremely competitive, and the pot of money is never big enough. So, if we do get funding and we are continuing into next year, then I think we would certainly consider possibly hiring an intern. But that is contingent on funding, as they say.
Right. Well, I'll just mention to the students, MITRE is one of the longest running, well, it's a set of FFRDCs, and they do a lot of interesting work in areas related to information processing, cybersecurity, and the like. And so generally, they're limited to US citizens. But if you're interested in interesting employment or internships, you should definitely check MITRE out as a possibility. And certainly, if you're interested in this work, contact the Panoptic at mitre.org. And we've had 3 questions pop up in that time. So can you see them, Stu, or do you want me to read them to you?
Yes, I can. So let me just go down the list. Yes, we are planning to add mitigation measures. That would be Panoptic has basically been going, as a research project, it's been going for about 2 years now. Assuming we get funding for a third and final year, it is our plan to develop mitigations for the attacks. These would probably be associated with the attack patterns that result from our clustering analysis. So, so the short answer is yes, we are hoping to do that. Is there a way to get access to the data set used? We are planning to make that available at some point. Basically, it's in the form of an Excel workbook, and we are going to get around to making that data set available along with the mappings. I'm not entirely sure whether it's going to have to go through MITRE's public release process or not in order to get it out there. So yeah, that's one type of resource which we would aim to get up on our webpage once it finally materializes. And then finally, what are the key motivations and objectives behind the development? Well, as I said, we think this has been a real gap. There's been, in terms of privacy risk modeling, we think there's been a real gap in terms of privacy threat modeling. We've seen a few things more recently. Most of those seem to be focusing on modeling threat actors and rather than modeling attacks. The closest thing that we have seen to what we are trying to do is Linden. However, I will say that, and hopefully the Linden people won't get too ticked off at me if they hear about this. My own personal view is I think Linden is actually much more about vulnerability modeling than threat modeling. And I'm not that there isn't a threat modeling step in there, but if you look at kind of the core of Linden, which is the stuff the actual acronym refers to, my own view is it actually it actually makes more sense to think of it as a vulnerability model, privacy vulnerability model, rather than a threat model. So in any case, there's this real gap, we think, and we're trying to fill. And certainly we think that ultimately Panoptic can kind of potentially be used side by side with MITRE ATT&CK. I want to emphasize that it is not attack for privacy, because the attack people get really ticked off when they hear people going around saying, yeah, we've developed attack for fill in the blank. But nevertheless, it was inspired by MITRE ATT&CK. And, I can certainly imagine somebody taking both in hand if they're dealing with personal information and using them in conjunction with one another.
That's great. Thank you. Not seeing any other questions, and we're almost to the end of our time here. Let me say thank you. This is a really a good step forward. Those of us who have been around for a while know that we've talked about privacy and security sort of similarly, or at least in the same phrase, for a very long time, although they are different. As I said earlier, privacy is a motivator for good security, and it's hard to have good privacy without good security. So they are tied, but the differences in capturing the differences and what you've begun to do here, I think, is a really great step forward. So we'll look forward to seeing this evolve, and maybe you can visit us on campus sometime in the not too distant future. I
would love to.
We'll continue to see how this develops. So for all the attendees who've listened in, thank you for being here. And we will be back next week at the same time with another speaker. So Stu, have a great evening, and we'll see everybody next week.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.